The dust in Elstro never seemed to settle. It clung to boots and wagon wheels, drifted into eyes, and hung in the air like a prayer no one ever finished. That morning, the market square was loud with trade Spanish and English voices colliding, the neigh of horses, the smell of sweat and leather. Thomas, 7 years old and small for his age, stood barefoot on the edge of the square, clutching a basket of bread. He felt invisible, as always, until the moment his own voice betrayed him. "Could you pretend to be my dad today?" "It's family day at school." The words tumbled out before he could snatch them back. He had spoken them to the tallest man he had ever seen. The cowboy wore a weathered brown hat, pulled low, a vest of rough leather, and a frame that made him seem carved from oak. His silence carried weight. He stood apart from the crowd as though the dust itself parted to let him through. People turned. A hush rolled across the market, quick and sharp. Mothers pulled their children closer. Traders froze with scales in their hands. Thomas swallowed hard. The giant cowboy looked down at him with eyes as dark and still as a deep well. For a long moment he said nothing, and Thomas wished the ground would open and swallow him whole. Then, with the smallest of nods, the man agreed. The square erupted. "That boy has lost his wits," muttered a ranch hand. "Half-breed asking a stranger to play father," another said, spitting in the dust. From the far end of the square, Mrs. Elizabeth Whittaker swept forward. Her black dress rustled like dry corn stalks, her pale eyes burning with righteous fury. She was the orphanage's patron, the self-proclaimed guardian of morals in Elstro. "This is an outrage," she said, her voice slicing through the noise like a whip crack. "Sister Margaret, remove the boy at once. And you, sir," she turned on the cowboy, "you will leave this place before I summon the sheriff." The cowboy didn't flinch. His hand rested easy at his side, near the worn grip of his revolver, though he made no move toward it. He only laid that steady gaze on Mrs. Whittaker, and for a moment even she faltered. Thomas pressed closer against the man's leg, his thin fingers trembling against the fabric of the vest. He could smell dust, horse sweat, and something else, sage, maybe, or smoke, the smell of the open sky. "He's my father," Thomas said suddenly, his voice clear despite the quiver in it. "He came for me." The market stilled again, Mrs. Whittaker's lips thinned to a sharp line. "That is no father, child. That is a vagrant, a savage drifter." "Have you no shame?" Eli Nantan finally spoke, his voice deep and calm, with the kind of weight that made people listen even if they didn't want to. The boy asked. "I came." The simple dignity in those words unsettled the crowd more than anger might have. Mrs. Whittaker's face flushed red, then white. "You have no standing here, no rights. This is Elstro, not some wilderness camp. Sheriff Coleman will hear of this. Sister Margaret, take the boy." 2 nuns hurried forward. Thomas clung tighter to the cowboy's vest, desperate. "Don't let them take me. Please," his voice cracked, breaking like dry twigs. For a heartbeat, Eli's hand hovered in the air, then settled gently on the boy's shoulder. It was not a promise of rescue, but of presence. He reached into the pocket of his vest and pressed something small into Thomas's hand, a strip of cloth, worn but carrying the faint scent of wood smoke. Thomas closed his fist around it, just as Sister Margaret's firm grip tore him away. The crowd began to move again, muttering, pointing, avoiding the sight of the boy being dragged across the square. Mrs. Whittaker's voice carried after him. "Discipline will cure this foolishness. 3 days on bread and water, and he'll forget this nonsense." Thomas stumbled as the nuns pulled him through the orphanage gates. He looked back once over his shoulder. Eli Nantan hadn't moved. He stood tall in the square, hat brim shadowing his eyes, watching without expression as the boy was taken away. Inside the orphanage walls, the discipline room waited, a narrow cell with stone walls and a cot no wider than a coffin. The door closed heavy behind him, the key turning with a final scrape. Thomas curled on the cot, his small body shaking, but his hand never opened. He pressed the strip of cloth against his cheek and breathed the faint smell of freedom. For the first time in his life, he didn't feel entirely alone. And as darkness fell, he whispered into the stillness, "He came for me. He'll come again." The discipline room smelled of stone and fear. Thomas sat on the narrow cot, knees drawn tight to his chest, staring at the sliver of moonlight that slipped through the small window near the ceiling. 3 days of bread and water was the sentence, but time stretched longer in the dark. His fingers still clutched the strip of cloth Eli Nantan had given him, the faint smell of sage and smoke refusing to fade. That scrap was proof that someone had come for him once, and it gave him courage enough to attempt the impossible. He waited until the orphanage fell silent, until the shuffle of the sisters' feet faded, and the other boys' whispers dissolved into sleep. Standing on the cot, Thomas pushed his fingers into the latch of the window. The iron was stiff from years of disuse, but small hands and desperate hearts have their own strength. The latch gave way with a soft scrape that seemed to echo like a gunshot. He froze, listening. Nothing. The opening was barely wide enough, but Thomas was thin from years of half meals. He wriggled through, skin scraping against stone, until he dropped into the alley behind the building. The night air struck him cold and sharp, and for the first time in his life, he breathed without the walls of the orphanage closing around him. The town slept except for a few lanterns in saloon windows. He padded barefoot through the empty streets, his heart pounding with each step. He had no clear plan, only a pull stronger than fear. He was looking for the giant cowboy. He was looking for Eli. Past the last row of houses, the desert stretched wide under a scatter of stars. Crickets hummed, coyotes yipped somewhere far off. Thomas walked until his legs trembled, guided by instinct and the faint smell of smoke on the cloth in his hand. Then, in a stand of scrub oak near the foothills, he saw it, the flicker of firelight. Eli Nantan sat by the flames, a tin cup in his hand, his broad back against a rock. The cowboy's hat lay on the ground beside him, and his long frame seemed carved out of the night itself. He looked up when Thomas stepped from the shadows. "You climbed out the window," Eli said, his voice low, even. "Yes, sir," Thomas answered, embarrassed by how small his voice sounded in the open night. "They locked me up." Eli studied him for a long moment, the firelight painting lines across his weathered face. Then he gestured to the ground beside him. "Sit." "You're hungry," Thomas didn't argue. His stomach gave him away with a loud growl. Eli tore a piece of roasted rabbit from the spit and handed it over. Thomas devoured it, hot grease burning his fingers but not slowing him. Eli watched in silence until the boy licked his hands clean. For a while they sat with only the fire speaking. Sparks lifted into the sky, joining the stars. Finally, Thomas asked the question that had been heavy in his chest since yesterday. "Why did you come?" "You didn't have to," Eli poked at the fire with a stick. "I had a son once," he said, his words as quiet as wind moving through pine. "He would be about your age now. He and his mother, they didn't survive a winter march. Soldiers moved us from our camp. Too little food, too much sickness. The world didn't leave room for them. The weight of grief settled between them." Thomas blinked hard, his throat aching. He wanted to ask more, but something in Eli's stillness told him silence was the better kindness. After a long while, Eli spoke again. "I can take you back, before they notice you're gone. You'll be safer inside the walls than out here with me." Thomas shook his head fiercely. "They'll punish me again. They'll make me feel like nothing. I can't do it anymore." "You're 7, Eli said gently. 7 years old can't fight the whole town." I don't need to fight the town, Thomas said, surprising himself with how steady he sounded. I just need to belong somewhere. Eli leaned back, studying him in the firelight. The boy's face was dirty, his hair tangled, but his eyes held a stubborn fire that reminded the cowboy of the child he'd lost. Where would you go if not back to them? With you, Thomas said simply. I don't care where, just not back. Eli's jaw tightened. He had spent years living on the edge of silence, his life stripped down to survival and solitude. Taking in a child meant opening wounds he had learned to bury. But the boy's words struck something deep. You'll live hard, Eli warned. No soft beds. No full plates unless you earn them. You'll learn the desert's ways, and it doesn't forgive mistakes. Thomas clutched the strip of cloth tighter. That sounds better than what I had. The fire crackled. For the first time since they met, Eli's lips curved in a small, weary smile. He reached out and set a large, calloused hand on the boy's shoulder. The gesture was light, yet it anchored Thomas more firmly than any wall ever had. Then we'll need to walk before sunrise, Eli said. They'll come looking. Men with dogs. They won't stop easy, Thomas's chest tightened with fear, but beneath it grew something stronger, resolve. He looked into the flames, felt the heat on his face, and whispered the truth that had carried him out of the window, across the desert, to this fire. I don't want to go back. The trail wound higher into the mountains, a thin scar through rock and pine that only Eli seemed to know. The boy's legs burned with each step, his bare feet raw from stone and roots. But he did not complain. He carried nothing but the strip of cloth in his fist and the belief that anywhere with Eli was better than the orphanage walls. Dawn light filtered through the trees, spilling gold over granite cliffs. The air smelled of resin and cold water, clean and sharp. After hours of climbing, they reached a hidden fold in the mountains where the pines grew thick and the sound of a creek whispered over stone. There, tucked against a rise of rock, stood a cabin built of hand-hewn logs and mud mortar. Its roof was weathered gray, its chimney leaning slightly, smoke curling from it like a quiet promise. To Thomas, it looked like a castle. This is where I live, Eli said simply. He pushed open the door with a shoulder. Inside, the space was spare but clean. A stone hearth, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, a bed in one corner, and a smaller nook curtained off by a hanging quilt. Everything bore the marks of Eli's hands, sturdy, functional, nothing wasted. You can sleep there, Eli said, pointing to the small curtained space. Thomas set down his treasures, just the cloth, a chipped marble, a broken tin soldier he had hidden from the sisters. On the rough shelf they looked like riches. He touched the quilt that hung as his door, patched with scraps of faded fabric. It was the first time he had ever had a space of his own. Life at the cabin was not easy. Water came from the creek, half a mile down a steep path. The first time Thomas carried the buckets, his arms shook so hard he spilled most of it before reaching the top. Eli only handed him 2 fresh buckets and said, "Try again." There was no anger in his voice, only expectation. By the end of the week, Thomas could make the climb without losing a drop. They hunted rabbits together, Eli showing him how to move silent, how to read tracks in dust. The first time Thomas caught one himself, Eli smiled, a rare, sudden thing that lit his weathered face. "Good work, son," he said, clapping a broad hand on the boy's shoulder. The word hit Thomas harder than the recoil of a rifle. Son. Not boy, not half-breed, not charity. Son. His throat tightened, but he held his head high, memorizing the feel of Eli's hand on his shoulder. Evenings were gentler. After chores and supper, they sat by the hearth. Eli's voice filled the cabin with stories older than the town, stories of coyote and eagle, of rivers and stars. One night he told how Coyote, always hungry, tried to catch fish like Eagle, but nearly drowned until Beaver pulled him out. "Being clever is not the same as being wise," Eli said, tossing another log on the fire. "And sometimes you need help even when you don't want to ask for it." Thomas curled under the patched quilt Eli had given him. The fire snapped in the hearth, the creek murmured outside, and for the first time in his life, silence didn't mean fear. It meant safety. He traced the seams of the quilt with his fingers, feeling every stitch as if they were made to hold him in place. The boy's body grew stronger with each passing week, his skin darkening under mountain sun, his hands calloused from honest work. More than that, he felt something grow inside his chest, something steady and fierce. Belonging. He lay awake one night, the quilt warm over him, listening to Eli's steady breathing in the next room. The smell of smoke lingered in the air, mingling with pine from the logs stacked by the wall. He closed his eyes and thought, "This is home." But even as the thought settled into him, a chill stirred in his bones. Because nothing good in his life had ever lasted. Somewhere down in the valley, anger still festered in Mrs. Whitaker's pale eyes, and the law had a way of climbing mountains. The storm was coming. The morning mist hung low in the pines, curling white around the cabin like a warning. Thomas was splitting kindling when he heard the sound hoofbeats rolling up the canyon like distant thunder. His hands froze on the hatchet. Eli stepped from the cabin door, his broad frame filling the threshold. He didn't speak, but his jaw set hard as stone. He had been waiting for this. The riders broke through the fog in a line of dark silhouettes, 6 men on horseback, rifles glinting in the weak light. Sheriff Coleman led them, his badge catching a flash of sun. Behind him, straight-backed in her black dress, rode Mrs. Whitaker. Her pale eyes burned with triumph, as though the mountain air itself bent to her will. "Eli Nantan," the sheriff called out. "Step forward with the boy. You're under arrest for kidnapping." The word struck Thomas like a blow. Kidnapping. That wasn't what this was. He stumbled back toward Eli, his heart hammering, then surged forward again, planting himself between the cowboy and the rifles. "Nobody kidnapped me." His voice cracked, but it carried. "I chose him. I asked him to come." The horses snorted and shifted. A murmur ran through the deputies, uneasy, but Mrs. Whitaker's voice cut the air like a blade. "You see how the savage has twisted him. He parrots lies. That child belongs to civilization, not to some outlaw squatter." Eli stepped forward, one massive hand resting lightly on Thomas's shoulder, steadying him. His voice was calm, though steel lay beneath it. "The boy speaks his own mind. He came of his own will." Sheriff Coleman dismounted, boots crunching against frosted grass. His hand hovered near his holster, but he did not draw. "Eli, you know how this looks. A child gone missing from the orphanage, found up here in your keeping. Law says I've got to take you in." For a breath, the clearing held its silence. Eli's revolver hung at his hip, worn smooth from years of carrying. His hand twitched once near the grip, then fell back. He looked down at Thomas, then out at the lawmen circling his home. "I won't raise my gun against neighbors," he said evenly. "If this is to be settled, let it be in court, not here in blood." Mrs. Whitaker's face flushed crimson. "Court? That boy is mine by right of guardianship. There is nothing to settle." But the sheriff hesitated. His eyes lingered on Thomas, on the boy's bare feet, planted firm in the dirt, on the way he clung to Eli not with fear, but with stubborn certainty. Coleman had seen plenty of runaways, but never one who looked more at home in the mountains than in town. "You'll come down with us," he said finally. "Judge Harrison rides circuit next month. He'll hear this out." Eli nodded once, the set of his shoulders easing, though his eyes never left Mrs. Whitaker. "Then we'll come," he said, "but the boy stays with me until the judge decides." Absolutely not, Mrs. Whitaker hissed. That child returns to the orphanage tonight. Thomas pressed himself against Eli's side, clutching the patched quilt draped over his shoulders like armor. "If you take me back," he said, his voice small but steady, "I'll run away again." And again. "Until I find him." The sheriff rubbed a hand over his jaw, weary. "Best to let the judge decide," he repeated, more to himself than anyone. Mrs. Whitaker snapped her reins, wheeling her horse with fury. "You'll regret this, Sheriff. All of you will." Her riders turned with her, vanishing into the fog the way they had come, leaving the sound of hoofbeats echoing down the canyon. Thomas clung to Eli, the strength of the man's arm anchoring him against the fear that gnawed his belly. The law had not drawn blood today, but its shadow had stretched long across their hidden home. When the hoofbeats finally faded, silence returned, heavier than before. The fog thinned, but to Thomas it felt as though the mountain had grown darker. He pressed his face against Eli's vest and whispered the truth he could not shake. "The law's coming for us." Eli said nothing, only tightened his grip. And in the stillness, Thomas knew the storm had only just begun. The town gathered in the courthouse square, as if drawn by the promise of spectacle. Dust swirled beneath the horses tied to the rails, and the murmur of voices rolled like a low storm. Eli stood tall beside Thomas, his broad shoulders squared, his brown hat shading eyes that missed nothing. Sheriff Coleman had brought them down from the cabin, his deputies close behind, and Mrs. Whitaker already waited with a smug, brittle smile that told everyone she expected victory. It might have ended there, an Apache drifter accused, a boy dragged back to the orphanage, but the crowd shifted as a new figure stepped forward. She was younger than most expected, her black hair pinned neatly beneath a straw hat, her blue-green dress plain yet touched with dignity. Clara Montiel, the new schoolteacher, carried herself with a composure that silenced the whispers. She had lost her husband 2 winters past to fever, and she had arrived in Elstro with nothing but a teaching certificate, a wagon of books, and eyes that missed nothing. "Sheriff," she called, her voice firm but respectful. "If this is to be a hearing, let the truth have its place." Mrs. Whitaker stiffened. "This is no concern of yours, Miss Montiel. You are here to teach spelling, not interfere with family matters." Clara's gaze did not waver. She held a leather folio against her chest, and when she opened it, the sound of paper crackling cut through the noise of the square. "I went through the school records, the parish files, the county archives. Some of the documents were misfiled, others were hidden. But I found enough." The sheriff frowned. "Hidden?" Clara lifted the first paper. "This is the baptismal record of a child named Thomas Matthew, born March 15th, 1874, to Maria Santos, a worker on the Whitaker Ranch, signed by Father Martinez himself. The father named in the record, Jasper Whitaker." The crowd gasped as if struck. Mrs. Whitaker's composure faltered for a heartbeat before she found her fury again. "Lies, forged by meddling hands. My father would never." But Clara's voice only grew steadier. "The documents bear his signature. And here," she unfolded another sheet, a letter from Jasper Whitaker, instructing that his son be given proper care and education equal to his station. Those instructions, it seems, were ignored. The sheriff stepped forward, taking the papers with careful hands. His eyes scanned the signatures, the ink faded but clear. He looked at Mrs. Whitaker. "These look genuine." "Genuine," she hissed, her face twisted, years of rigid control cracking. He was a weak old man in his final years. Confused, taken in by some servant woman's tricks. That boy is nothing but a bastard half-breed. He will not taint the Whitaker name. The square erupted in voices, some shocked, some angry, some whispering old rumors given new life. Thomas's chest felt tight. The world spun as the name settled on him like an unwanted cloak. Whitaker, the very name he had heard used as a weight of power, the name that had kept him small in the orphanage, now bound to him by blood. He should have felt triumph. Instead, he felt sick. Eli's steady hand found his shoulder, grounding him. The boy looked up and found not judgment, but a quiet strength in the man's dark eyes. Sheriff Coleman cleared his throat. If these papers are real, the boy has rights inheritance, a claim to the estate. This changes matters. Mrs. Whitaker Elizabeth's face went pale, then red with rage. That land is mine. Everything my father built is mine. I will not hand it to some savage's whelp, Clara's voice cut in sharp. Your father's blood runs in his veins as surely as yours. The difference is, the boy never asked for wealth or position. All he asked was a family. All eyes turned to Thomas. His knees shook, but he forced himself to stand straighter. He looked at the papers in the sheriff's hand, then at Mrs. Whitaker's twisted face, then at Eli, who had given him more than any name could. His voice trembled at first, but grew stronger with each word. Whatever my name is, he said, I still want to stay with Eli. The square fell silent, the words ringing against the walls like a church bell. And in the silence Thomas felt both the weight of the world and the first spark of freedom. Elstro was no longer a quiet town. Every corner carried whispers, every saloon and church pew buzzed with argument. Some said Thomas belonged to blood, that a Whitaker heir should never be raised in the cabin of an Apache. Others shook their heads at Mrs. Whitaker's venom, remembering how she tightened her grip on land and money, while children at the orphanage grew thin. Lines were drawn, not just in families but in friendships, and the town felt brittle as glass. Clara Montiel moved through it all with steady resolve. Her soft blue dress brushed the dusty floors of the sheriff's office, the church rectory, the lawyer's cramped study. She gathered documents, recorded testimonies, wrote letters late into the night by lamplight. With her stood a lawyer from Tucson, a man with ink-stained fingers who specialized in property disputes and custody law. Together they pieced a case brick by brick, exposing how Mrs. Whitaker siphoned ranch profits into her own accounts while claiming charitable virtue. Donations meant for the orphanage, Clara said one evening, sliding a ledger across the table toward Eli. Half of them never reached the children. The ranch workers say they were told food was too expensive, yet receipts show barrels of flour delivered straight to the Whitaker kitchen. And there's more payments to men who don't exist. Names invented to cover her theft. Thomas sat close to the fire, his patched quilt pulled around his shoulders, listening though he didn't fully understand. He only knew Clara's voice carried strength, like the teacher who refused to let truth stay buried. Eli said little. He sat with his hands resting heavy on his knees, eyes fixed on the flames. Later, when Clara and the lawyer left, Thomas reached for him. "She's helping us," the boy whispered. "We can win, can't we?" Eli's chest tightened. He looked down at the boy who had grown stronger in these mountains, the boy who smiled now with a courage that lit even the darkest nights. And yet, behind that smile was a name heavy with legacy Whitaker, a name tied to land, money, expectation. He rose and stepped outside into the night air. The moon rode high, silvering the pines, and the creek whispered steady as if nothing in the world could change its course. Eli leaned against the post of the porch, his broad shoulders hunched, his hat pulled low. Could he be enough? He was a man who built his own home from stone and timber, who lived by the rifle and the snare. He had no estate to offer, no schooling beyond what the land taught, no power except his hands and his word. A Whitaker heir deserved more. He closed his eyes, hearing again the taunts from the town. Savage, outlaw, thief of children. The sheriff's men might hold back for now, But when the judge came, law would speak louder than any quilted hearth. Behind him, the door creaked. Thomas padded out, bare feet silent on the porch. He slipped his small hand into Eli's. "I don't care about the Whitaker name," the boy said softly. "I care about you." Eli turned his head, the lines of his face carved deeper by firelight spilling from the cabin. His heart swelled, but fear pressed in heavier still. He lifted his hand, rough and calloused, and rested it on the boy's head. "If what's best for you is leaving me," he murmured, voice low as the wind in the pines, "I'll let you go." The words tasted like ash, but he said them anyway, and the night seemed to hold its breath, as though it knew the storm was drawing near. The courthouse in Elstro had never held so many people. Farmers in worn hats, ranchers in Sunday coats, merchants with their wives clutching parasols, all pressed shoulder to shoulder, hungry for the spectacle. The air was thick with dust and anticipation, the murmur of voices swelling like the sound before a summer storm. At the front sat Judge Harrison, a weathered man in his 60s with a face like the land itself, creased, sun-baked, but steady. He rapped his gavel once, and the room stilled. "This court is convened to determine the matter of Thomas Matthew, a child claimed by Mrs. Elizabeth Whitaker and by Eli Nantan. Allegations of kidnapping, questions of inheritance, and the boy's welfare shall be heard today." Thomas sat between Eli and Clara, his patched quilt folded tight in his lap. His feet barely reached the floor, but he held himself upright. The stares of the crowd burned against his skin, yet a steadiness he did not know he possessed kept him from shrinking back. The sheriff's lawyer rose first, laying out Mrs. Whitaker's case with smooth words. "The boy is of Whitaker blood, but illegitimate. By law, his guardianship falls upon the family, and Mrs. Whitaker has borne that burden for 7 years. This man," he gestured toward Eli, "an Apache drifter, has unlawfully taken him from lawful guardianship. That is kidnapping, plain and simple." Murmurs rolled through the room. Mrs. Whitaker sat stiff-backed, her hands folded, a mask of righteousness on her face. Then Clara rose. She did not need theatrics. Her voice was clear, her papers in order. She placed ledgers and letters before the judge. "These are records of estate funds diverted, donations meant for the orphanage that never reached the children. Half the food and clothing pledged was stolen, rerouted to Mrs. Whitaker's personal stores. The orphanage ledger shows children growing thin, while the Whitaker table groaned. The judge's brows knit as he turned the pages. The crowd shifted, scandal buzzing like hornets. "Furthermore," Clara continued, "the boy's baptismal record lists his father as Jasper Whitaker himself. That makes Thomas not a burden but an heir, and one shamefully hidden for convenience." Gasps broke from the benches. Mrs. Whitaker's lips pinched white. "Forged," she spat. "All of it. Lies made by a meddling schoolteacher." Father Martinez, stooped with age but steady in his black cassock, took the stand next. His hands trembled as he held the Bible. "I baptized the child," he said softly. "I kept his record, though I was pressured to remain silent. Jasper Whitaker confessed the boy was his and left instructions for his care. Those instructions were ignored." The judge leaned back, his gaze heavy on Mrs. Whitaker. "Ignored?" The priest nodded, shame etched into every wrinkle of his face. "I feared Elizabeth's wrath." I remained silent too long. The courtroom roared with whispers and outrage. Judge Harrison lifted his hand for silence. Then he looked down at Thomas. "Young man, you've been much spoken about today, but I want to hear from you. In your own words, why did you leave the orphanage?" Every eye turned to him. Thomas's throat went dry, but he stood. His small fingers twisted in the quilt, yet his voice, though shaky, carried through the hall. "Nobody wanted me," he said. "For 7 years, families came and looked at us. They always passed me by. They said I wasn't pure, that I didn't belong. I scrubbed floors. I ate last. I slept in the corner where the wind came through the boards. I felt like I wasn't real. A silence fell so complete that even the dust seemed to hang motionless in the air. Then I met Eli, Thomas continued. His voice grew steadier, stronger. He didn't treat me like I was broken. He taught me to carry water, to hunt, to work. He told me stories by the fire. He called me son. For the first time, I belonged. I wasn't invisible anymore. Eli looked down at the boy, his face unreadable, but his eyes glistened with the weight of words too heavy to speak. The judge's gaze moved from Thomas to Eli, then to Mrs. Whitaker. He tapped the gavel once, not to silence, but in thought. This court has heard grave charges and deep truths. There is no simple resolution. The matter of inheritance, of guardianship, of the child's best interest, these are questions I must consider with utmost care. He looked out over the packed hall, his voice rising. I will weigh the evidence, I will hear the law, and I will render a judgment. Until then, the boy remains under the court's protection. This case is adjourned for deliberation. The gavel struck, sharp as a gunshot. The room erupted in noise, anger, hope, disbelief. Thomas sat again, his hands trembling, heart pounding. Above the roar, the boy caught one thought that lodged like a stone in his chest. The judge would decide. His future hung by a thread of law, and the whole town seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the verdict. The second day of the hearing drew an even larger crowd. Word had spread fast, and the people of Elstro packed the courthouse until men stood shoulder to shoulder and women pressed against the walls, their fans stirring only dust. Farmers had left fields untended, ranch hands postponed cattle drives, all to witness what had begun to feel less like a custody hearing and more like the trial of the town's own conscience. Clara Montiel arrived with more documents. She laid them in neat stacks before Judge Harrison, her calm voice carrying across the room. These are account books from the Whitaker Ranch. Names of laborers who never existed, payments written but never received, flour and beans pledged to the orphanage but diverted to private stores. It is theft dressed as charity. The judge's brows lowered as he studied the pages. Around him the murmurs swelled, outrage threading through the crowd. Mrs. Whitaker sat rigid, her face white as chalk, but her voice cracked when she rose. Lies. This is an attack on my character by a woman who barely belongs here. She seeks to elevate a bastard child over me, the rightful steward of my father's estate. Clara's reply came quick, sharp as flint. Your father's own hand named that child. You buried his instructions. You denied him food, warmth, dignity. You let him grow up in rags while you sat in silks. Gasps rippled through the benches. Some of the townsfolk nodded grimly. Others looked away, shame creeping into their faces as if they too had ignored what they should have seen. Judge Harrison turned to Father Martinez, who stood trembling but resolute. You testified yesterday. Will you confirm again Jasper Whitaker recognized this boy as his son? The priest's voice wavered but did not falter. Yes. He confessed it in my presence, and I wrote his wishes. I failed that boy when I stayed silent. For that, I will answer to God. The room stirred with unease. Men who had worked Whitaker land muttered curses. Women shook their heads in disbelief. The proud name that once carried weight now sagged beneath revelation. Thomas sat at the front, quilt folded over his knees, eyes fixed on the judge. He had listened to the shouting, the accusations, the truths clawing their way into daylight. His chest felt tight, but when the silence opened, he stood. Blood doesn't matter, he said. His voice was small but clear, carrying farther than he thought possible. Belonging does. I belonged to no one until Eli. He called me son. That's what makes a family. The hush that followed was so deep that even the gavel did not break it. People stared at the boy who had been invisible all his life, now shining with a truth simple and unshakable. Mrs. Whitaker surged to her feet, her face twisted. "You will not strip me of my name and lands for the sake of a savage's pet." "That boy is nothing," the crowd groaned, voices rising in protest. Someone shouted, "Shame!" Another cried, "We saw him grow thin while your table overflowed." The air shifted. The people who once bent under Elizabeth's influence now recoiled from it. Judge Harrison struck the gavel hard, the sound echoing like a rifle shot. "Enough. This court will not be a brawl. I have heard testimony, seen evidence. I will deliberate before issuing final judgment." His gaze softened when it landed on Thomas. "Until then, the boy is to be placed under the care of the Territorial Welfare Office. Neither Mrs. Whitaker nor Mr. Nantan will claim him until this matter is resolved." The air drained from Thomas's lungs. Welfare Office. Another set of walls, another set of strangers. The quilt felt suddenly thin in his hands. He looked at Eli, who sat unmoving, but in his eyes Thomas saw pain carved deep as canyon stone. The gavel came down once more, ending the session. The crowd erupted, some cheering, some jeering, all caught in the storm of change. And in the middle of it, Thomas clung to the only truth he knew, that the law had taken him again. But his heart still beat with the choice he had spoken. He belonged to Eli. And now he had to pray the judge would see it before it was too late. The courthouse groaned with the weight of bodies pressed inside, the air heavy with sweat, dust, and expectation. Men leaned forward on benches worn smooth by decades of disputes. Women clutched handkerchiefs, eyes darting between the judge and the boy at the front. Outside, the square was thick with horses and wagons, neighbors waiting to hear the outcome, as if the fate of one child might change them all. Judge Harrison sat solemn behind the bench, his gray hair caught in a shaft of afternoon light. He had read every word, turned every page, listened to every accusation and confession. Now, as he cleared his throat, silence rippled through the chamber. Even the restless creak of boots on wood ceased. "This case," he began, his voice firm but tinged with weariness, "has forced us to weigh questions that reach deeper than blood, beyond property or reputation. It has asked us to decide whether guardianship is measured by law alone or by the conduct of the heart." Mrs. Whitaker sat stiff-backed, her pale knuckles gripping her fan. Eli remained upright, broad shoulders steady, his hat resting on his knee. Beside him, Thomas clutched the patched quilt, his thin frame taut with fear and hope. Judge Harrison lifted the first document. "Evidence has shown that Mrs. Elizabeth Whitaker mismanaged funds intended for the orphanage. Donations disappeared into personal accounts, while children under her care went hungry and cold. Testimony from Father Martinez confirmed that Jasper Whitaker named this boy, Thomas Matthew, as his son and heir. This court cannot ignore such facts." A murmur rose, anger swelling like thunder. The judge's gavel struck once, sharp and final. "Therefore," he continued, "this court hereby terminates the guardianship of Mrs. Whitaker. She has failed in her duty and betrayed both law and conscience." Gasps filled the room. Elizabeth's face drained of color, then flushed crimson. "You dare strip me," she began, but her voice was swallowed by the roar of the crowd. The judge turned to Eli. "As for Mr. Nantan, the charge of kidnapping is dismissed. The boy was not stolen. He sought protection, and Mr. Nantan provided it with dignity and restraint. The law will not punish compassion." Eli inclined his head, his face unreadable, though his chest lifted with a quiet breath. "Yet we cannot ignore the matter of the boy's inheritance and his future," Judge Harrison pressed on. "By blood, Thomas Matthew Whitaker is heir to a portion of the Whitaker estate. By law, his interests must be safeguarded. Therefore, I rule as follows. Custody and adoption rights may be granted to Mr. Nantan if, and only if, he accepts certain conditions. The room hushed again. All eyes swung toward the bench. First, the judge said, raising a hand, Mr. Nantan must establish permanent legal residence within this territory. Second, he must ensure that Thomas receives education, either through the local school or approved tutoring. Third, Thomas's right to inherit his share of the Whitaker estate shall be preserved until he reaches majority. The child's legacy must remain intact. He let the words hang. Do you accept these terms, Mr. Nantan? Eli rose slowly, towering in the wooden chamber. His voice was deep, steady as the ground beneath them. I do, Your Honor. I will build what must be built, sign what must be signed. The boy will have schooling, and when he is grown, he will claim what is his. But more than land or name, he will have a home. A ripple moved through the crowd. Some nodded, some frowned, but none could deny the force of the man's quiet conviction. Judge Harrison turned his gaze on Thomas. And you, son? Adoption requires not only the guardian's consent, but the child's. Do you wish to live with this man as your father? Thomas's throat tightened. His heart pounded so loudly he thought the whole courthouse must hear it. He looked at Mrs. Whitaker, her face twisted with rage, then at Clara, who gave him the smallest nod of encouragement, then at Eli, his anchor, his home. The boy stood, quilt slipping from his shoulders. His voice rang out, small but fierce, filling every corner of the hall. Yes, sir. Yes, I do. For a moment there was silence, then the room exploded. Applause, shouts, pounding feet. The people who had once whispered half-breed now cheered, moved by the sight of a boy choosing family with his own voice. The judge struck his gavel, though even he allowed the corners of his mouth to soften. Then, by authority vested in this court, I approve the adoption of Thomas Matthew Whitaker by Eli Nantan. May this union bring stability, dignity, and belonging. Mrs. Whitaker sagged against the rail, her fan dropping useless to the floor. Deputies shifted behind her, already prepared for charges that reached beyond this hearing. Clara's eyes shone with relief. Sheriff Coleman leaned back, exhaling as though a weight he had carried for months had finally lifted. Amid the clamor, Eli bent down, his voice a whisper only Thomas could hear. My son. Thomas felt his chest swell until he thought it might burst. His answer came with tears and a trembling smile. Father. The gavel struck again, but this time it sounded like a benediction. And the whole courthouse knew that the story of the boy and the giant cowboy was not ending here, but only just beginning. The wagon creaked along the rutted trail, climbing higher into the folds of the mountains. The October air was sharp, scented with pine and wood smoke, the sky clear and endless above. Thomas sat on the bench beside Eli, clutching the patched quilt like a banner of victory. Behind them, the courthouse and its suffocating crowd faded into memory. Ahead, the cabin waited. When they rounded the last bend, Thomas gasped. The small stone and log house stood just as it had before, but now it felt different. No longer a secret refuge, no longer borrowed time. This was home, recognized by law, sealed by love. Eli drew the horses to a halt. For a long moment he simply looked at the place he had built with his hands, weathered by storms and seasons. Now it would shelter more than himself. It would shelter a family. Go on, he said, voice soft. Thomas leapt down, racing to the porch. He pressed his palms against the rough wood of the door, grinning back at Eli. It's ours, he whispered, almost reverent. It's really ours. Inside, nothing had changed, and yet everything had. The stone hearth glowed with embers, the creek outside still sang its quiet song, The small room with its blanket partition still waited for Thomas. But when Eli lifted the quilt from his hands and spread it carefully across the bed, it felt ceremonial, like laying a crown across a king's shoulders. That night they ate rabbit stew and cornbread by the fire. Eli sat in his chair, silent as always, but the set of his shoulders had eased. Thomas sprawled on the floor with the quilt tucked around him, eyes heavy but shining with contentment. In the days that followed, life settled into rhythm again. Water to haul, wood to chop, traps to check. Yet now every task carried a different weight. Thomas was not a runaway hiding from the law. He was a son working beside his father. Clara came often, riding the narrow trail with books and supplies strapped to her saddle. She opened a small school in town, determined to give every child Mexican, Apache or white, the chance Thomas had been denied for so long. Some parents resisted, but more welcomed her, grateful for a place where children might learn letters instead of only labor. She stopped at the cabin one evening, her blue dress dusty from the ride. "He's quick with numbers," she told Eli, nodding toward Thomas, who pretended not to listen. "And stubborn with words. He'll fight a sentence like it's a steer to be roped, but he doesn't give up." Eli's mouth twitched, the closest thing to a smile. "Gets that from me." Clara's eyes lingered on him longer than before, warmth flickering there. He met her gaze briefly, then looked back at the fire, but something unspoken passed between them. Not promise, not yet. Just possibility. Winter came. Snow blanketed the roof, smoke curled steady from the chimney, and laughter echoed through the cabin. Thomas had never known such peace. On a clear morning, Clara arrived with a photographer who had traveled through town. They set the heavy camera on a tripod in the yard. "Stand close," she urged. Eli placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder, broad and steady. The boy leaned against him, quilt draped across his arm. The photographer ducked under the black cloth, then called, "Hold still." When the shutter snapped, it caught more than an image. It captured belonging. Later, the print would hang on the cabin wall, proof for any who doubted. Here was a family, chosen and true. As spring returned, the cabin bloomed with life. A small garden took root, tended by Thomas with fierce pride. The creek sang louder with meltwater, and Clara's visits grew more frequent. Neighbors began to stop by too, ranch hands offering fence posts, farm wives bringing preserves. The town that once looked at Eli with suspicion now found itself drawn to the quiet strength that held his home together. One dawn, as light spilled pink across the peaks, Thomas stood on the porch with Eli. The boy's face was calm, older somehow, the hard edges of fear worn away by safety. "This is home," he said again, but this time it wasn't a whisper. It was a vow. Years later, the vow still held. The epilogue belonged to a different morning. Thomas, now grown tall with broad shoulders like Eli, rode the trail with a boy of his own at his side. The child's eyes were wide with wonder at the sweep of the pines, the glitter of the creek. When the cabin came into view, smoke rising gentle from its chimney, Thomas felt his throat tighten. Eli sat on the porch, hair white now, but his frame still strong, still upright as a pine. The boy slid from his horse and ran ahead. "Grandfather," he shouted. Eli's face broke into a rare smile as he lifted the child into his arms. Thomas dismounted slowly, letting the moment wash over him. He remembered the first time he had stood before this cabin, a scared boy clutching a scrap of cloth. Now he was a man, bringing his son into the circle of love that had saved him. That evening, 3 generations sat by the fire. Thomas's son nestled beneath the same quilt that had once wrapped a frightened orphan. Stories were told of coyotes and rivers, of justice and mercy, of the day a boy asked a giant cowboy to pretend to be his father. And when the boy fell asleep, Thomas looked at Eli and said quietly, you taught me the truth. The roots we choose are stronger than the ones we're born with. Outside, the mountains stood eternal, the creek whispered on, and the stars above burned steady. But inside the cabin, chosen love burned brighter still, and though this story had found its close, another waited just beyond the horizon. For in every small town, on every frontier, there were children searching for belonging, and men and women strong enough to choose them. Stay with us. More tales of the Western legacy are yet to come. Subscribe and be ready for the next ride into the heart of the frontier.